So I'm Mary Cornish. This is my colleague Jen Keto. We're so pleased that everybody is here, and we're hoping that this will give you some, both a bit of kind of 101 again of many of you may have already been involved in these issues, others of you may have not, talking about closing the pay gap in Ontario. And we have a premier who's given a mandate that we're to close the pay gap in Ontario, and that the government is to work from what she describes as the activist center. So we thought this would be a good opportunity to get people together. The ministries that have particular responsibility for it are Labour and ministry responsible for women's issues, but one of the things why we wanted people from all ministries to come today is to recognize that actually closing the gender pay gap is something that affects all ministries. So we've had some people say, well, I'm not coming because it doesn't affect my ministry. You know, I'm either in energy, forestry, or whatever, without kind of understanding that it affects all ministries. So some of you may have been here back in, maybe not, I don't see many people as old as me, but when the government started in '85 was when it actually had a green paper which said we were going to close the pay gap. And at that point, it was also actually recognized there was a broader way of doing it, but we started off with the Pay Equity Act. We then had an Employment Equity Act, which was then repealed. And then you'll see as Jen will start and give you an initial introduction, we're still back at a very large pay gap that we're trying to close.
I wanted to first thank you all for being here on your lunch hour on a Friday. But I also wanted to thank you all for the work that you do every day as civil servants in serving the public of Ontario. And what better way to continue serving the public of Ontario than to work together to close the pay gap. So I'll first guide you through what we want to achieve in this presentation. The first is an overview of what the pay gap is. The second is demonstrating why government actors and civil servants such as yourselves need to make it an urgent priority to develop comprehensive and proactive measures to close the pay gap. And the third is to leave you with some resources that you can take back to your office and that can guide you in the work that you do. And just as a bit of an FYI, there will be some slides that I won't be speaking to, but that's because I hope to hit kind of the highlight points right now. So you can take this home as a resource, all right? So as I said, closing the pay gap is important to serving Ontario's public. And this was recognized by Premier Kathleen Wynne in her mandate letters, which set out the goals of the ministries during their term. And I'll briefly go through two of the mandate letters. The first is to the Minister of Labour to develop a wage gap strategy. The minister was directed to work with the minister responsible for women's issues and other ministers, right, meaning the whole government of Ontario, to develop a wage gap strategy that'll close the gap in the context of the 21st century economy. And as well, the mandate letter to the minister responsible for women's issues highlights promoting and ensuring that a gender lens is brought to government strategies, policies, and programs. And today we'll be talking about what a gender lens means and giving you resources as well as to how to actually put that into effect, because I can appreciate how it kind of sounds like a vague concept right now. So I'm on the third page of the slide. And in order to really tackle a problem, you need to know what the scope of it is, right? So I'll start off with some numbers. The numbers from Statistics Canada, referring back to 2011 data, show that the wage gap was 31.5% based on average annual earnings. And what's interesting is this can almost be considered as a baseline wage gap, because when you take other considerations into account, like racialization, immigration status, disability, identity as an Aboriginal person, it actually serves to grow the pay gap. So that's what's interesting about this figure. And when we talk about this gender pay gap, I guess there's two types of harms that I want to highlight. The first is the economic hardship, right, faced by women, but also anyone who's surrounded and, dependent on a woman, right? You have husbands, fathers, sons, cousins, what have you. And this spreads out and towards the community as well. So there's a social harm element there. But there's also the economic macro harm that is being done to the province of Ontario by not realizing and harnessing the potential of half of its workforce. So these are the reasons why this problem is something that needs to be addressed. Now, I wish I had the slide to show you the graph, and the slide would be in color, but I'll briefly highlight, this is the lower slide here, the gaps between men's average annual earnings, that's the line with the little triangles on it. Women's average annual earnings, that's the line with the square. Men's full-time average earnings, that's the line with the, I think the diamond. And women's full-time average annual earnings. So what I want to highlight with this is, first of all, the recognition that there are many ways to measure the gap, but what is consistent with whatever way that you measure the gap is that a gap exists. Numbers may be different, but they still show that there is a wage gap in Ontario. And that's what I think needs to be one of the primary take-homes from today's session. Now, of course, in looking to address the wage gap and how you can fix it, it's important to also understand what are the causes of it. And there are several causes, but we're limited for time today, so I'm going to highlight, I guess, what I think to be the most prominent ones. And right now, I'm on page 4 of the slides, the bottom slide. So I first want to talk about the undervaluation of women's work. Because people often discuss, well, I'm paid the same as my male counterpart, thus there is no wage gap. But we also need to focus on where women work and what industries are predominantly filled by women. So I'll just kind of ask you, you can just nod your head. Have you heard about the pink ghetto? Okay. So the pink ghetto refers to this phenomenon where women are clustered into certain occupational groups or industries, mostly typified by caring work, education work, healthcare, and clerical and administrative functions. And this type of work engages tasks and responsibilities that are associated with being a woman and left invisible and therefore not compensated. So I'll just guide you through that. So, for example, things like high-level communication skills, multitasking, fine dexterity skills, and care and nurturing are seen to be, I guess, attributes and skills that are associated with being a woman, not skills that are acquired, right? You always talk about a doctor and his bedside manner, but sometimes when you talk about a nurse, it's not really a concept you think of. There's maybe an assumption that that caring element has to be there. So that's what I mean when I talk about the invisibility of women's work. And if it's invisible, it can't be valued. If it's not valued, it's not compensated. And this is how we get to the undervaluation of women's work. Two other of the main points that I want to speak about is, besides the content of women's work, is kind of the contractual status of women's work. And what I'm referring to here is the rise in precarious employment for women. Women, more than men, are engaging in casual type of work, part-time work, and contract work. And when you add the lack of affordable childcare to the mix, and what we're coming on now is the sandwich generation, these constraints, they constrain women from full participation in the economy. So I'm going to wrap up now by having set out what the problem is, what some of the causes are, but now we're getting to the really interesting part of the presentation when we're speaking about the ways in which we can address this.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about, very briefly, that there's an international gender equality framework, particularly around women's compensation, which would be ILO Convention 100 and ILO Convention 111. 100 being the actual equal pay for work of equal value convention, and 111 being the general convention that says that there should be equal treatment in both occupation and employment. In addition, there are international instruments on the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, which also address the issue of gender equality of women in respect to the economy. If you come and bring it down into Ontario, you have the Specific Pay Equity Act, you have the Ontario Human Rights Code, and then as a government, you have the Charter as well. So you're both, in your day-to-day work in the government, you're specifically bound by the Pay Equity Act. Depending on what it is, you're bound by the Human Rights Code, which binds the Crown, and you're also bound by the Charter in your actions to make sure that what you're doing is securing gender equality. And there's a particular role of the state as under human rights law, both here and generally, to in fact promote women's equality. So one of the important other takeaways I think today is to address the issue of the pay gap from a human right perspective, because it's important to give it a priority, and one of the things we find is it's very easy to lose its priority, which is one of the reasons we still have it, right? Is that people, you're sitting there, you've got budgetary constraints, you've got this or that, and something goes out the door. Pay equity funding for public sector adjustments was one of the things that went out the door as money got tight, right? A variety of things happen in which you say, well, we really can't do that. Or, and I think this is a more general, and it may sound a little harsh, but in a way the Ontario business and governments depend on paying women less than they're worth. I mean, really, that's how it operates. You deliver public services, a lot of it by women, because predominantly in healthcare and education, it's women who are providing your services, and really, there is not gender equality in their pay. And we've had compensation freezes, a whole series of things that have frozen in that inequality. So that's one of the things that you have to think of, is what is the role of government in relation to that, and how does it play out in relation to austerity and a series of things when you're kind of balancing things. If you look on it as a human right, it kind of takes a bit of a different perspective on it, all right? And one of the things that I thought was kind of interesting, I went through this morning and searched through the mandate letters of every ministry. What do you think were the only two that referred to women? And only two did. Labor? No, Labor and the Women's Directorate. Okay. No reference anywhere in any mandate letter to women. Which was really, I actually was astounded, because I thought they'd be somewhere, right? Children are somewhere. They're in the children's thing. And the other interesting thing of who's in some of the mandates letters is disabilities, right? And one of the reasons, and they fall in a number of the mandate letters, right? And part of that is the AODA, right? And the requirements in those ministries to be doing something, and in the AODA. But closing the gender pay gap, or even women generally, like there's no reference. And part of that leads, and part of the problem is assuming you don't mention them because it's the same thing. Do you know what I mean? If you're carrying out your task, it doesn't matter if you're carrying them out. You don't need to mention them differently because women and men are the same thing. So one of the things that I think would be a great first task is to go through the mandate letters and try and figure out how the government's priorities could in fact be used to help close the pay gap by just using those priorities. But it was a bit of a stunner to understand that it only got in those two mandate letters, and really it only got in those two mandate letters because we've spent a hell of a lot of time trying to get it in those mandate letters, right? As did the disability groups, right? They spent years and years and years trying to get their issue embedded in government decision making, which they finally managed to do, even though they're still struggling to get it implemented. But at least it's there in the agenda. And as all you know, unless something's in your ministry's priorities, it kind of goes out of the attention because you're assigned to do what is your ministry's priorities. So that's just a thought. Keep the human right focus in mind. The other part, which is, as Jen talked about, is that really it's essential to economic recovery. And there's all kinds of international documents that talk about this, from the World Bank, the World Economic Forum, the IMF, that really women are essential to the economic equality and economic prosperity, and gender equality is essential. So we need to get on track with that. The other part of it, which was interesting, is just in the recent government policy with respect to sexual harassment and violence, which was also, we think, a very important part of closing the pay gap, is actually redressing that, because it has a real effect on women's earnings, what happens to women when they're in those situations, right? But what was very interesting was that the attempt to look at that issue more broadly. And if you read that action plan, it was different than other action plans. It actually referred to misogyny. It was a very direct, more systemic approach to a problem. And so that's some of the things that you'll find with closing the pay gap, that if women have higher earnings, they're more likely to be able to leave abusive relationships. There's all kinds of connections that happen once you start looking at women's pay. The other aspect of it is, you'll see there's, if you move forward a few pages, you'll see there's references to some of the international documents on it benefiting businesses in the economy. The 11 steps to close the pay gap, we actually had 10, and we added ending violence against women into as an 11th step. Those were steps that the coalition, and we worked with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives about developing those steps, the first of which was treating it as a human rights priority, but also it was planning. As many of you know, in ministries, if something's not in a plan, it doesn't happen, because you have to have a plan, you have to have a way to get someplace. Somebody needs to be accountable for it. You need to have measures. Those are the kind of things that happen. And so, again, going back to the disabilities, when you started to have a plan, I mean, in our office, because of the Accessibilities for Disabilities Act, you know, the office now has to say, what is it doing, when is it doing it, how is it doing it, right? That's the measures that you start sending out across the province. Similarly, those kind of things have to happen in ministries. You know, how are we going to close the gender pay gap through what we do? So the other issue is that we've thought for many years that the first approach was our Pay Equity Act, right? We would have the analysis, we'd compare women's and men's work, and that was what we would do. And the Equal Pay Coalition got letters back for years to the ministers saying, we have the most progressive pay equity law, that's what we're doing to close the pay gap. And we'd say, well, you know, there's more to do than that. And in 2008, we called for a broader framework of action that also looked at the intersectionality issues that Jen also talked about, in terms of the fact that the pay gap is larger for more vulnerable workers, for racialized workers, for Aboriginal workers. So that's the thing to think about as well, is it isn't just a matter of the Pay Equity Act. The Pay Equity Act is important, the Human Rights Code is important, but you also just have to think about it in terms of your own planning. And that's what brings us to the gender lens. If some of you were in the government back in the late 80s and 90s, do you remember when you had to have a gender impact analysis to go to cabinet? Some people do. So that used to be what you had to do. Every cabinet submission had to have a gender impact analysis. So people would have to go around and figure out, how did their policy affect women and men, and what did it do to promote gender equality? And then that was eliminated. And as a result, people stopped that process of having to do that. Because one of the things that helps, I know, in government, is to actually have a mandate that you're required to do it, because then you spend time on it, it's authorized, and it's something that's appropriate to do. So now what the government has with its gender lens, and it's said, the Premier has said, there will be a gender lens to all programs, policies, and strategies, all right? Well, then how do you do that, right? What does that mean to do that? And it actually is being done in a series of other places. And so I've given you a document. If you look in your materials, you'll see there's a document called Applying the gender lens to government, to close Ontario's gender pay gap. And what I've done there for you is pulled together excerpts from various gender-based analysis tools, some international, some Canadian, that actually set out frameworks and steps. They set out how to conduct in a whole planning cycle. For example, as you go through it from start to finish, how would you do it in order to try and have a gender lens generally? You'll see that there's one that's quite specific that I've given you some excerpts from, which was an Aboriginal Affairs one that went through under a specific topic. It's quite actually, the whole text of it is quite long, but it'll set out, you know, how do you conduct your consultation using a gender lens? How do you conduct your research using a gender lens? The Canadian Human Rights Commission also has what's called a gender integration framework, which it uses in its work. And part of why the federal government has done more about it is that Canada was actually the leader in developing gender-based analysis. It was our gift to the Beijing Conference in 1995. The World Conference on Women was a gender-based analysis. It was called the Federal Plan for Gender Equality. And other countries around the world actually adapted from that document, and it's used internationally, but it kind of went a bit by the wayside. And so the Auditor General actually did a study federally, and I've included excerpts from this in here, which gives you some history about it, saying it's really not being used enough federally. So part of what happened out of that as well was that the Canadian Human Rights Commission created its own gender integration continuum, which again takes you through the steps of a process. It's also been used in the healthcare sector. So for example, there's a women's health framework in Ontario, and it used a sex-based gender analysis in terms of trying to analyze the issues around women's health. How are men's health issues different from women's health issues, for example? But I think you'll find them quite useful for trying to actually practically try and figure out what does it mean when you adapt it to a pay gap lens. So one of the other things that you'll see in the PowerPoint, and there's a more detailed list in your materials, but at the PowerPoint, if you go forward a few pages, you'll see a thing called some questions or issues to consider. And in your whole materials, I've actually got 1.5 pages of these questions where I adapted from various of those integration frameworks that I'm talking about, questions that you would ask in your work, okay? So the first one would be, how can new strategies and policies and programs be developed or existing ones modified to serve to close and not widen the gap? Now, one of the things is you immediately say that is, well, how would we know that, right? Like, how would I know whether what I was doing was widening it or closing it? So one of the things is to sort out, one is data, and even internationally, data is one of the most fundamental both resources but also problems, is getting enough sex disaggregated data to figure out even what is the impact of your work. Because at various points it wouldn't have been collected, right? So you may not know what the data is. So if you had a project, do you know how many women or men are employed in it? Now, you may know, I'm in the health ministry and most of who I employ is female, or who I fund is female, right? But in other ministries that may not be apparent. And you may be having work that's primarily male work that you're funding. And is there room for having more female work being funded or trained for in your projects? For example, I remember back in 2008 meeting with the Ministry of Finance people. I tried to meet with them before the budget, and nobody had time till after the budget. And then I said, well, you know, you need to have a closing the gender pay gap framework. And they go, well, what are you talking about? And so we tried to talk about how you could do it in infrastructure. Like, who do you employ on these infrastructure projects, right? It was right at the time when there was a whole lot of infrastructure money. And they thought, I think I had 3 heads. So I was going, have you analyzed who's employed on your infrastructure projects? No, right? Well, that might be one thing. What are your infrastructure projects building, and who are they building them for, right? Could you be building childcare centers? What is it that you're building? Where is women's employment? How would it affect or help women's employment. So there are a lot of ways in which you can look at things differently if in essence what you're trying to do with the gender pay gap at this point is increase women's earnings. And so as you'll find from the facts, part of the problem with the average annual gap, which is 31.5%, is you have women who are earning very little, right, who are in that amount, right, in the average, because it's everyone. You have women who are working part-time and can't get enough full-time work, so their average is lower than other people because a higher number. So getting that gap closed requires a whole series of things. You'll have people at home who might be working and having a higher wage, but they're still at home because they don't have childcare. There are people who aren't getting promotions that should be getting promotions because they're actually qualified to do it, which would raise their pay. So how are we doing that? We used to have an Employment Equity Act, and part of what the Employment Equity Act did was try and deal with some of those issues. So that's why the unemployment equity provisions are part of these 11 steps, right? How do we work it so that you can analyze, even at a business level, for example? One of the ways of analyzing, and these things are being done increasingly, is you could analyze at a business level this 31.5% gap by just analyzing the pay in the business to the female employees and the male employees and see what happens. Like, what is the average pay of both, right? Which wouldn't be hard to do, right? So the other, so those are some of the issues. The other issues are, how are you going to incorporate it into budgetary decisions? So for example, when the government did the compensation restraint measures, I actually was successful in getting into one of them, that it would exclude Pay Equity Act and Human Rights Code amounts, right? But it actually doesn't really work in practice that way because the government isn't funding people to pay those amounts. So public sector people aren't being able to actually get those adjustments because there isn't any really efficient public sector money to get it. But in essence, those kinds of things should not be taken into account, that those women would not get pay equity adjustments during the period of restraint. In other words, we need to set aside the money for those adjustments. The other side, and I'm going to stop just in the last thing, is we've actually have called in our framework to have a province without a pay gap by 2025, which is the same year that we're supposed to have an accessible Ontario. And one of the ways I think we can do it is by actually trying to embed various of these gender lenses and policies around differences in planning into the structures that you have. And I know that the government has said it's going to be having a wage gap review panel, but I think part of what will be happening in your own ministries will be the work by the ministry responsible for women's issues to actually work with each of the ministries about getting the gender lens going. And of course, the gender lens is broader than the pay gap, right? The gender lens is it's going to cover everything. And maybe we'll hear more about that on Equal Pay Day. So one last thing, I wanted to go through, and I'll just give you some examples. I went to some mandate letters, and of course they're not mentioning women, but to give you some ideas of what it would mean. So if you go to the one that's for development, employment, and infrastructure, it talks about creating jobs. So one of the things is, who are you creating the jobs for, right? And maybe there is, I don't know about it, maybe there's a whole gender analysis of who jobs are being created for, but that's one of the things that you would do here. You would look at your projects and figure out, here I've been mandated by the Premier to create jobs. Then the issue is, what kind of jobs are you creating, right? Are you creating good jobs, sustainable jobs? Are they jobs that will lead to women having more full-time work? Are they jobs that will allow them to have childcare? Are you training women to take those jobs? And sometimes in these mandate letters it says do this while maintaining something else. So even when it talks about fiscal restraint, one of the ways to look at that is, how can you do fiscal restraint while ensuring women's right to gender equality and pay is also preserved. So that's part of the balance. Another one, for example, is the Attorney General. So they're supposed to, and they're responsible for the Human Rights Code. So one of the things is, what is the Attorney General doing in terms of accessible and enforceable rights to make sure that women's rights under the Human Rights Code are being enforced, and that also in relation to compensation. So that's another aspect that you could look at. And then another one I looked at was, just the Deb Matthews and Treasury Board. So that one is actually responsible for compensation in the public sector. So that's a direct way in which you would look at saying, is what I'm doing in compensation actually closing the pay gap? Or have I actually widened the pay gap by what I just did, right? So that's a very specific, direct kind of analysis that you could do to figure out what is the effect of when I make that public sector position, am I serving to actually freeze women in a certain spot? Okay, so those are all our comments. We're going to actually put the materials up on the Equal Pay Coalition's website, so you'll have them electronically. And